Good morning, everyone. I'm Peter Hollenbeck, a professor of biological sciences, the vice provost for faculty affairs, and the official mascot of the Resilient Extraterrestrial Habitats program. I want to welcome you to the inaugural seminar for the RETH program. Our distinguished speaker today is Thomas D. Jones, PhD, a scientist, author, veteran, pilot, and NASA astronaut. After his graduation from the Air Force Academy, he was an active duty pilot for 6 years before completing his PhD in planetary sciences at the University of Arizona. Dr. Jones spent more than 11 years with NASA and flew on 4 space shuttle missions to Earth orbit. On his last flight in particular, he led 3 spacewalks to install the American Destiny Laboratory on the International Space Station. All told, he has spent 53 days working and living in space. Dr. Jones' awards from NASA include its Distinguished Service Medal, 4 Space Flight Medals, the Exceptional Service Award, the Outstanding Leadership Medal, and the Exceptional Public Service Award. He also won the Air Force Commendation Medal and was Phi Beta Kappa. Well done, sir. He's the author of several space and aviation books, among which I strongly recommend to you Skywalking, an Astronaut's Memoir. Finally, here's yet another honor for Dr. Jones, one I really envy. The main belt asteroid 1082 Tom Jones is named in his honor. How cool is that? Well, please join me in welcoming to the podium Dr. Thomas Jones, who will speak to us about reaching for the moon, the asteroids, and Mars.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's getting on towards lunchtime. I hate to be the last obstacle between you and lunch. So I'll try to keep it on time, and then I'll have some questions at the end. So I'm really glad to be at Purdue today. It's a place I've heard a lot about because so many of my astronaut colleagues have come from Purdue. I think when I looked it up yesterday, it was 23 space flyers have come from Purdue. So you guys have a great tradition of producing explorers and innovators, and I hope that we'll continue to see that. I have no doubts about it. What I'm going to talk about today is the prospects for us exploring in deep space. Human exploration is about, I think, to break out of this routine or rut that we've been in Earth orbit for the last 30 years. And, well, actually, it's more like 45 years. And I'll talk about the status of human exploration today, sort of our starting point, and take you from there through the rise of commercial space flight, talk about deep space exploration and some of the challenges and the habitat challenges that your program will face with the Resilient Extraterrestrial Habitats challenge you've got, and then talk about new challenges and new explorers, which is, again, where Purdue will come to the fore, I'm sure. So my career, I'm not going to give you a talk about my career, but I was able to fly on the space shuttle 4 times during the height of the space shuttle's 30-year career during the 1990s. And my career opportunities encompass 3 science missions aboard the space shuttle, a couple of Earth observation missions, 1 to do astronomy and material science. And then on my last trip, I went to the International Space Station to help build it. So it really was just a construction flight. But it really encompassed everything that you could do on a space shuttle, rendezvous and docking and cargo transfer and delivering a world-class science laboratory to the space station and I got to do 3 spacewalks. That was the highlight of my career as an astronaut. So space is a wonderful place to work, and there was no more engaging job I have found in my career than working in the space program with the NASA colleagues. Best people I ever worked with, dedicated to a goal that was motivating the team, and it was such a satisfying part of the job element to be a member of that NASA team doing exploration and laying the groundwork, I hope, for what's coming in the future. And Tom, if you'll click the cursor on that one so we can roll this video. This is a video of the International Space Station in orbit, and I think it's moving now, yes. So it's just a sped up B-roll of the space station scene from a departing space shuttle. So you get a sense of that outpost out there. And it is the current focus of space operations today for the NASA program and all of its international partners. 6 people can live aboard the space station. I helped build it. It's much bigger than when I visited it. It's truly the most impressive space object that we've ever built. It's the most complex engineering international project that's ever been done in human history. And it provides world-class research facilities for our learning about bettering our lives back here on Earth, and also testing the technologies that we need to go deeper into space. So International Space Station is where we've been living continuously in space for the last 16 years. And I hope there will never be a time in the future of humanity when we don't have humans living off the planet continuously. This is our foothold in permanent habitation of space for the moment, and we'll certainly go beyond that in the future. You get an idea of the size of the space station. As I mentioned, there's a crew of 6 that's typically aboard. Happens that this week, one crew went home about a week ago Monday, and so there's only 3 people living aboard the space station. But 3 international labs. There's an American lab called Destiny, which my crew delivered on the space shuttle. There's a Columbus lab, the European lab, and there's the Japanese laboratory up there. So it keeps the 6 crew members occupied with research tasks continually, and maintaining the outpost 220 miles above the Earth. You see here the crews that were most recently up there. 3 of them have come home, and those 3 would be on the left. Shane Kimbrough from NASA and his 2 Russian colleagues, they came home about 10 days ago. And then on the right, Peggy Whitson is the commander, and her colleagues Thomas Pesquet from Europe and Oleg Novitsky from Russia. So typical tour up there, 6 months is the average stay of a crew member, and that's well within the comfortable biomedical envelope of understanding that we have for keeping humans productive and healthy up there. As you know, last year Scott Kelly spent 340 days at the space station with his Russian colleague, Mikhail, what was his last name? Well, Kornienko. And so Peggy and Thomas and Oleg are going to be up there through the early months of the summer. In fact, she's going to stay there till September. Her tour will be 8 or 9 months up at the space station. 57 years old, she's a colleague of mine. She was the chief astronaut while I was departing NASA in 2001. And I think she's spent more expeditions than any woman on the space station. This is her 3rd one. Done more spacewalks than any woman in history, and she's, as I said, she's the oldest female to fly in space. Most experienced, certainly. That's the space station today. At the top are the 3 laboratories, Destiny and Columbus and Kibo. And Antonio, you gave me a pointer, so I could use that. Let me find it here. American lab, Destiny, that, as I said, I was involved in installing. European lab right here, Japanese lab over here. And then there are living quarters in this Node 2 module called Harmony. There's a habitation module called Node 3, which is buried under this structure, the truss structure. And then there are some Russian living quarters here at the back in the Zvezda module, and I'll get to the details of those in a second. One of the challenges that you have supporting people for the long term in space, you've got to deal with all the hazards and challenges of the space environment. One of them is micrometeoroids or man-made space debris. And so if the space station is flying forward in space in this direction to the right, you can see the impact risk portrayed here. The leading edges of the space station will get the most hits as you encounter space junk and space debris and micrometeoroids. And so the space station has had to be designed with the understanding that in its 20-year lifetime, it's going to be struck and probably damaged, and you're going to have to be able to withstand such impacts and then repair them as time goes on. So here's an example of a photograph of an impact that occurred on one of the solar arrays, and that led to a failure of the electrical wiring, the circuitry there, that led to an overheating of this particular solar cell that then fractured. So the impact didn't shatter the glass, but the cutting of the wiring nearby did that. So it didn't really affect the functioning of this huge solar panel, but over time you might have a critical cooling line or an electrical power cable severed that the crew would then have to go out there and fix. In fact, the living areas on the space station, including the Destiny laboratory, the US laboratory, are armored against debris strikes. So they know that they're going to be hit. These panels individually bolt on to the outside of the machine. And so you've got a layer of 1/8 inch thick aluminum. There's a Kevlar blanket inside that, some thermal insulation inside that, and then there's the 3/8 inch thick aluminum pressure hull of the laboratory. So you've got what's called a Whipple bumper system, where you shatter the impacting object, break it up into smaller pieces, slow it down so that as it goes through the successive layers, it won't, in the end, penetrate the pressure hull. So far, haven't had any penetrations of the pressure hull, but we've had debris impacts all over the station. And if something was bigger than about the size of a pea going at Earth orbital velocity, it would go through all of those layers and penetrate one of the modules. So far, so good. There's the space station as I saw it back on my last flight aboard the Atlantis. And as we pulled away, we could see the new Destiny laboratory, the Russian living quarters at the back. There were 3 people living there at the time, and of course it's grown by leaps and bounds over the years. Inside, you could see us living in free fall on the space station. And my friends who have lived up there for 6 months, they truly become home. They truly treat space as their home. They are adapted as a human organism to that free fall environment. So that was the brand new laboratory that we delivered. You can see it's brand spanking new. We just have a few items of equipment installed. We basically turned on the lights when I was there. And this is the way the space station looks now, the Destiny laboratory interior. So there's one of those reality home organizing shows that should go up there and help them out. But that's Kate Rubins, and the interior of the Destiny lab now is just covered with scientific gear and cameras and computers and wiring that enables all the science activity inside the lab. It's really the nerve center of the space station today. So when you're thinking about habitat designs of the future, you would like to give the crew some kind of approach to building this habitat that gives them perhaps not this cluttered effect. This is very utilitarian, but it's probably not as pleasing to the eye as you might like for a multi-month journey in space. So more storage space, more ways to put things away and know where they can be located out of the way. It's almost like a kelp bed that you have to swim through to go through there. Living aboard an outpost like this, I've had the experience of sleeping up there for 50+ days. That's me sleeping on the left in the space shuttle, where you can just clip your sleeping bag anywhere. And as soon as you close your eyes, you feel like you're falling back into the deepest feather mattress that you'd ever imagine. It's very comfortable, and you fall asleep within just a few minutes at the end of a busy workday. But it's noisy, and you can be brushed by another crew member going by, and there are pumps and fans that can wake you up, sunlight coming through the windows. So on the space station, they've, of course, thought this through, and they've given people individual crew quarters. That's Samantha Cristoforetti from the European Space Agency. And on the space station, there are 4 bunks for the Western astronauts, and this is one of them. She's tucked into her sleeping bag. She's got private space, acoustic insulation. There's even radiation baffles built into the walls of this compartment so that they drop the radiation dose by about 16% using polyethylene plastics to absorb some of the solar protons and cosmic rays. And here's a view of that Harmony module where you've got 4 of those sleep bunks around the perimeter of the module, and everybody is shown popping out of their sleep cubicle in the morning. At the back of the space station, this is the inside of the sleep bunk with a wide-angle lens. So you see the sleeping bag for Scott Kelly. He's got a personal laptop. He can watch DVDs. He can read a book. He can talk to his family on Skype, essentially, and you can put some photos, personalize this space for yourself. That's your little private abode. You have your clothes that you can change into, stash your personal effects there. Back at the back of the space station is the Russian living segment that's called the Zvezda module, and when it was launched, it had 2 bunks built into it. And so I'm floating in front of one of those bunks in the Zvezda module while I'm working in an IMAX camera here. But a better view is in this picture. That's one of the Russian cosmonauts living in one of those little cubicles back in Zvezda. So they've only furnished 2 bunks in that module. That means one of the Russians, typically there's 3 aboard, they would live up in that ring of bunks with the American and Western counterparts. They actually have a porthole, though. So it's a little bit better quality of aesthetic experience in the Russian crew quarters. But you get more radiation that way with the porthole. So it's a trade. Now, when I was working back at NASA, we were envisioning adding to the space station a habitat system that was called TransHab, and it was designed to get away from these metal shells, which are heavy and they cost a lot to launch. That's the way the space station is built, with conventional metal hulls, to an inflatable structure. And this is called the TransHab, transportation or transit habitat for going to Mars in the future. And so it was a multi-level inflatable habitat that could be packaged compactly, launched, and then inflated with air to provide a living space. And we actually got it to the full-scale mock-up stage. It did pressure tests in the big altitude chamber down at the Johnson Space Center, but it ran out of funding in the early 2000s, and so it never actually was realized as an addition to the International Space Station, and then would serve in deep space. But Mr. Bigelow, who's an entrepreneur in Las Vegas, has taken the technology under license from NASA, and he has produced a little experimental inflatable space that's been flown to the space station. It's going to be up there for about 2 years. It's called the Bigelow Expandable Activity Module. And it's plugged into Node 3, and it's been inflated. And so it's undergoing structural and radiation protection evaluation. What's the acoustic environment in there? How do you circulate fresh air and so on? So here are 3 of the crew inside the beam on a recent expedition last fall. That's Kate Rubins that you saw earlier, Jeff Williams, and their Japanese colleague there. So there's nothing in there. It's just a closet. And they don't even put equipment in there. It's just to evaluate how the structure performs in the harsh environment of space. Thermal protection, micrometeoroid protection on the outside. Is there any radiation benefit from having an inflatable fabric structure versus a metal hull? So that's an experiment in progress. So that's where we are today with the International Space Station, and its lifetime will stretch out to 2024 or 2028. And we should be using it as a proving ground for all the exploration technologies that we need to go farther out into space. So some of the habitat concepts that you come up with here, maybe subsystems, life support, things like that, could be tested at the space station before they have to go on real life and death, performance-dependent missions to deep space. But we've entered a new era with this big government space station run by governments around the world. We've entered a new era where commercial space is playing an increasing role in our ability to explore and to station humans in orbit. And that's the commercial launch capability that we've seen come about in the last half dozen years, and those capabilities are growing by leaps and bounds. You know, I got to the space station and back on the beautiful space shuttle Atlantis here, but she's in a museum down in Florida at Kennedy Space Center, and has been since 2011. And so without access to low Earth orbit, the United States has been forced to use its partner capability, the Russian Soyuz rocket, to get to and from the space station. But there's a price. You know, our partner has the nice rockets, they're reliable, they're fairly inexpensive, but the Russians are pretty good capitalists by now. Over these last 25 years, they've learned a lot about the rocketry market, and this Soyuz capsule has 3 seats inside it. That's how people get to and from the space station today. They charge anywhere from $75 to $80 million a seat. So if you're an American going to the space station, your agency will pay them $75 million to train you, to transport you, and to bring you home safely again. If you add that up, 6 Americans a year, it's almost $500 million of transport costs. And that money should be, well, long since we should have been flying people out of Kennedy Space Center again on a commercial basis. So the history of this, I won't go into it a great deal, but the Obama administration canceled the NASA fleet of rockets that was to provide transport after the shuttle, and instead said, we're going to do commercial contracts for astronaut transport. And that's the path that we've been on for the last 6 years, and it's probably going to be another couple before we go operational. But that path started first with commercial cargo. Just this morning at about 10 after the hour, the orbital ATK company, which usually flies the Centauri's rocket under contract to NASA to deliver cargo, launched a cargo canister called the Cygnus, the SS John Glenn, to the space station. It successfully lifted off on an Atlas V rocket. So a commercial cargo provider used a leased Atlas V from United Launch Alliance and flew it out of Cape Canaveral. SpaceX, Elon Musk's company, flies the Falcon 9. So both these companies have been doing this for about the last 5 years, flying commercial cargo shipments for NASA to the space station. So that enabled us to get out from under the Russian cargo monopoly, and enabled us to have a couple of ways to get to and from the space station for cargo. This is the reusable first stage of Mr. Musk's company, the Falcon 9, landing back here on a barge out on the ocean. So he hopes to drop the cost enough with this technology that NASA will benefit, and so will his other satellite customers. Moving on to astronaut transport, NASA hopes to fly their people to and from the space station on either one of these 2 commercial vehicles, the Boeing Starliner and the Crew Dragon from SpaceX. So both ships are on the verge of human testing. Probably next year you'll see the first astronauts launch from Cape Canaveral to the space station, and then it will go operational sometime 2019, late 2018, and then NASA will have its own path back to the space station. Interestingly enough, the Russians will still fly on these vehicles, and we'll still fly an occasional astronaut on the Soyuz just to maintain the ability to operate both of those ships should we have to send somebody home in an emergency. You don't want to leave only Russians at the space station. That would be bad. And then the Russians don't want to leave only Americans at the space station. That would be bad. So if you have both of if you have your crew members qualified on both fleets, then you can always leave one nationality up there riding on another partner's vehicle. So look for humans flying again next year from Kennedy Space Center. There's also the suborbital market, and this is the tourism market that we've been hearing about for the last 10 years. The history of the commercial tourism market for space has been, we're going to fly tourists to space in 2 years. only 2 years away, and that's been the case for the last 10 or 15 years. So this is Spaceship Two flown by Virgin Galactic. They're within 2 years of launch with tourists. And this is Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin New Shepard suborbital capsule. This is just an artist rendering, but reusable launcher, comes back and lands on its tail, and then the capsule parachutes back to Earth. And he says he's about 2 years away from flying. And we know Mr. Musk is offering about a $250,000 price point for his suborbital voyage to 100 kilometers. We don't know the price point for Blue Origin yet, but he's probably going to compete against Musk. Oops, forward. And companies like Blue Origin, SpaceX, they have big ambitions. Elon Musk announced that he's going to fly people around the moon in 2018 on a Crew Dragon. There's not a snowball's chance in hell that he's going to do that. He might do it in 5 years, though. He might do it in 5 years. And Jeff Bezos, with Blue Origin, plans to build these New Glenn rockets that will rival the old Saturn V moon rocket that you see here on the right from the Apollo program. And if these companies, both the Falcon 9 Heavy from SpaceX and the New Glenn, if they go into production and operation, they will provide another means for NASA to get heavy payloads to orbit aside from its own government-built system to do that. So the commercial space sector is going to play a tremendous role in enabling humans to establish and maintain a presence in deep space. And you'll never see an all-government solution to exploration in the future. It's going to be supplemented by commercial partners who bring innovation and more of an entrepreneurial, edgy approach to performance out there in space. So that brings us to the subject of how you get humans out there beyond the space station. We once were there with Apollo back at the end of 1972. We finished up our early explorations of the moon, and we haven't been back since. And I would like to see in my lifetime, certainly, us getting out as far as the moon and then even to Mars eventually. NASA's building a purpose-built deep space system to do this. It's called the Orion spacecraft. It carries 4 people. This is the first test article that flew back in 2014 on a high Earth orbit, successfully returned to Earth. And that spacecraft is slated for another mission in late 2018, early 2019. This is the Orion that's being built for that mission called Exploration Mission 1. So this is the deep spacecraft that NASA will operate for about the next 30 years. And it'll probably be part of expeditions to Mars one day in terms of providing the transport to and from an interplanetary mission. And it's going to fly on this big rocket on the left, the Space Launch System, which dwarfs the old shuttle system that I used to fly. It's got more takeoff thrust based on shuttle technology, about 8.8 million pounds, than the old Saturn V moon rocket that flew for Apollo. So it's a heavy lifter, and it's designed to put big chunks of habitats and landers, as well as the people in the Orion spacecraft, up into trajectories to the moon, the asteroids, and eventually Mars. Here's a little video clip to show you what that first launch will be like in 2018. Tom? Nice government commercial there for you. And I'm very impressed with the Purdue sound system. That's the best sound delivery I've ever heard for that video clip. So that's a Space Launch System. I never saw a Saturn V fly when I was a kid. If you are planning a break at the end of 2018 or early 2019 when they schedule this launch, I would take my vacation and go to the Kennedy Space Center and watch this rocket fly. It's going to just rattle your bones, and it will be an awesome spectacle. It carries 70 metric tons to low Earth orbit, and the later cargo version will carry 130 metric tons. But it's a government rocket. It's being built by Boeing and other contractors, so it's very expensive. And so the hope is that the commercial space companies will provide some fraction of this capability at a much lower cost. And you may not even see this Space Launch System survive for more than 10 years or so. The NASA Inspector General says that the launch date of 2018 for this rocket is in doubt because of technical challenges that they're encountering. The costs are going to go up, according to the IG. So we don't know the future of this system, but it certainly has the capacity to do what we want in space. And I'm an optimist. I think it will fly successfully, and they'll find a way to drive the production costs down and fly it at least once a year to reduce it as it goes through the assembly line process, reduce the cost. 4 people can fit inside the Orion capsule riding on the SLS. No crew on this 2018 flight. It's the first test flight of a new rocket. You don't want to fly people on it. But we will have the capacity to fly people on the next ride, 2020 or 2021. I think the Trump administration will try to put people on this as soon as possible, just to claim that in the first 4 years of the administration, they got NASA back on track. And so you'll see people in 20 or 21 flying out to the moon, maybe on a 3-week mission to circle the moon. We did that during the Apollo program. Nothing new about this scientifically, but it demonstrates the capacity of the spacecraft and the rocket in a way that you can't simulate on the ground. And eventually, that opens up the moon to further exploration. The south pole of the moon is shown right here. This big, low, it's a depression, the South Pole Aitken Basin. Giant asteroid impact dating back about 4 billion years ago. And the core and mantle of the moon had just finished their formation. So the samples thrown out from this asteroid impact are lying around on the surface and in the margins of this basin. If we can bring back information about that impact and the samples of rock from the moon's interior, we'll open up a new chapter in studying the moon, our twin planet. Also at the south pole of the moon are shadowed craters where the sun's slanting rays never penetrate. And so they are very cold, and millions of tons of water ice are suspected to be on the floors of these polar craters. And if we can harvest that ice, we have now oxygen to breathe, water to drink. We have rocket fuel oxygen and hydrogen that we can use on the moon for our activities there and then for exploration beyond the moon. What we should be doing right now is NASA should be launching a rover every year to the moon and robotically explore those water deposits. There's only one mission that's planned right now in the early 2020s to sample those ice deposits and extract some of the water from them at the south pole of the moon. But we should be hitting the moon very hard with robotic technology and then prospecting it for a future human presence there. NASA is now talking about moving that Space Launch System and its Orion to lunar orbit and then building a small outpost there in the middle 2020s that would have habitats and cargo modules arriving. There's the cargo module, there's the habitat. It would have a propulsion system, solar power, and the ability for astronauts to visit for, let's say, a month at a time, and then operate robotic systems on the surface through teleoperation. So that would be a job for astronauts in lunar orbit in the mid-2020s. But no plans right now for NASA to go to the surface of the moon, even though our international partners would very much like to see that happen. NASA has continually done studies of habitat design for operating on the moon. This one was from NASA Langley about 10 years ago, an inflatable structure like we saw with TransHab or that Bigelow structure. So there have been some thought put into how you would establish humans on the moon. The role for humans, scientific, number one, to conduct long-range driving sorties across the lunar surface to understand more about our neighbor in space, collect the right samples that we need to understand the history of the moon. But also, I think humans will probably be necessary to set up production plants for water and other valuable materials on the moon. The robots can do it on a routine basis, but to get it set up and put it into operation, you'll probably need human intervention. So there's a role for humans at the moon. There's also a role for humans at the asteroids, the nearby near-Earth asteroids. Here's the Earth-Moon system. A few million miles away, you have these random visitors coming by, and these near-Earth asteroids have minerals on their surface that contain water. And we can harvest the water using solar energy as well. So here's an Orion expedition to a near-Earth asteroid in the late 2020s, early 2030s. And we visited a couple of asteroids robotically. This was visited by the Japanese spacecraft Hayabusa. We know something about some of the varieties of asteroids, but by no means do we have broad knowledge of the asteroid population. And we need to have that because they keep falling on us, asteroids. And we will go the way of the dinosaurs eventually if we don't have the space skills to nudge a future impactor off course. So in the 21st century, to my mind, one of the greatest benefits of space exploration, human and robotic, would be to develop the skills to deter or to divert an asteroid from a future collision with Earth. 1,000 people were sent to the hospital by that one 4 years ago over Chelyabinsk, Russia. And that will happen again, 100% certainty. We know from the meteorites that fall on us that we do have these water resources out there. Murchison's about 10% water, Tagish Lake about 20%. So all you have to do is bake these objects gently to a few hundred degrees C, and you'll get the water out in the form of water vapor, and you can use it to create rocket propellant in space. How you do that in free fall? That's a challenge left for the students here. But there are companies, and I'm an advisor to one called Planetary Resources, that plan to mine the asteroid. So don't try to read the whole chart, but if you find a water-rich 500-meter asteroid right here in the center, that object, in terms of the water shipping value that it costs you to send water into space, that's about $5 trillion worth of saved launch costs to extract the water from that half a kilometer wide asteroid. And that's rocket fuel, it's breathable air, and it's drinking water. So these companies have been set up to make a profit offering water and even some precious metals from the asteroids, like platinum group metals, to the market. And the market will be space agencies like NASA, who says, hey, I need 150 tons of hydrogen and oxygen propellant in orbit next year to do my next asteroid mission. They might buy it from a commercial company producing it from the asteroids. A lot of steps have to occur before that can be commercialized, but it's certainly the natural thing that we must do to take advantage of the resources in space to lower the cost of operations and exploration out there. We cannot stay in this model of Apollo where we ship everything up from the ground and use nothing that's already present. Some very expansive thinkers here have invented a system where you use solar energy to bake an asteroid that you've bagged, and you capture the water vapor coming out of it, and then you process it into rocket fuel and drinking water and so forth. So this is the market, or this is the production facilities that are envisioned for future activities between the Earth and the Moon. That company I mentioned in Seattle, Planetary Resources, last year they took this step. They powdered a meteorite that's made of nickel and iron, and they used a 3D printer to make this complex three-dimensional structure out of asteroid metal. So it's the first time that anybody's made something useful or interesting to look at out of asteroid metal. Now, you can't do this very easily. Nickel-iron asteroids are very hard to process, but you can, in principle, make things in space out of the resources that are already there. And there have been experiments at Northwestern University where they've taken asteroid or moon or Mars dirt and combined it with a polymer and produced by 3D printing components that you see here. So we are going to be hopefully moving towards a situation where we manufacture the structures that we need, not just the rocket fuel and the breathing gas, but the structures that we need off the planet from natural resources. And so well out into the 21st century, 50 years from now, we might be in a situation where we can harvest solar energy streaming by the Earth 24/7, beam it down in the form of microwaves, feed it into the electricity grid. And so if you're trying to move the human civilization away from fossil fuels and into renewables, this is a renewable system where you've got endless amounts of solar energy and you can provide limitless power to Earth's electricity grid. That seems very far-fetched, that you could harvest these solar energy isn't far-fetched, but building giant structures to do that seems far-fetched. It's very expensive to launch them from Earth. But if you can make them in space with lunar or asteroidal materials, this would be the way to break that cost barrier. And remember, when Thomas Edison invented the light bulb in, let's say, 1885, 50 years later, the United States was electrified. 50 years. So something on this scale was unimaginable to somebody living in 1885. So we might very well find ourselves in 2070 thinking that it was impossible now, but it's actually come to fruition in half a century. Stranger things have happened. Well, let's talk about the red planet. That's where all of you would like to live someday, I'm sure. I just came from a presentation where the Purdue students were evaluating Elon Musk's claim that he could have 1 million people on Mars in 20, 30 years. Is that the deadline? 100 years, thank you. 1 million people on Mars, establishing a Mars colony. What's the likelihood that we'll see this in my lifetime or your lifetime? Technically, there are no big obstacles to prevent humans getting to Mars. We certainly have a lot of experience getting our robots there. Contractors like Lockheed Martin have proposed creating an orbiting base camp around Mars, a space station around Mars that would enable you to study the planet from close up, have astronauts first operate rovers on the surface and then construct an outpost robotically, and then they would go down to the surface after this outpost had been established. In the 2030s, Orbital ATK came up with this concept to use their space station cargo vehicle and combine them into a mini station around Mars as well. So all the contractors have big ideas about how NASA can bootstrap itself from lunar orbit, maybe the lunar surface, out to an asteroid or two, and then to Mars one day. And you might explore the moons of Mars, Phobos and Deimos. If we find out that these asteroid-like objects are wet and have water resources, then that would be an important refueling station for expeditions down to the surface of Mars. This could happen technologically 20 years from now, in the mid-2030s. Now, if you're going to establish these habitats in the Mars system, a lot of work has to be done on how you support people and keep them healthy up there. There have been a number of studies done over the last 20 years about habitats in deep space. And NASA even now is spending about $50 million this year on contractor-conducted industry studies about how to build a deep space habitat. This is a Johnson Space Center effort. It's called the Human Exploration Research Analog, the HERA. And they've flown successive crews in this habitat that has multiple levels and a hygiene module, just to study the psychological and layout issues of how you make a nice, attractive environment for a crew on the way to or orbiting Mars. You may have heard of this effort, the high seas habitat on the slopes of Mauna Loa in Hawaii. Several crews have gone through living in this dome habitat with an adjacent laboratory on the slopes of Mauna Kea, a very Mars-like environment. Solar powered, and they put them in there for 8 months or a year, and they ask them to stay isolated and have time delay radio communications with Earth. And again, they're studying the psychological factors, the human factors for making an attractive workspace and living space. Last summer, one crew was released from about 8 months in the high seas habitat here. They interviewed one woman who was on the crew, and they asked her what the challenges of living in the habitat in a Mars-like environment were. She said number one challenge was boredom. Even though they had scientific work to do out here on the slopes of the volcano, that wasn't enough to keep her occupied. And she said the number two challenge was getting along with everybody else on the crew. And then the question was, well, you must have become very close, you four, while you were living together in this habitat for the last 8 months. Are you going to stay in touch? And she said, with some of them. So humans in small spaces for long periods of time, it's a space experience that I've had, and I haven't gotten along with everybody that I flew in space with, and we're going to have to find ways to give people the privacy they need and yet continue to build up the teamwork and the morale that they need to successfully do a job over 3 years on an expedition to Mars. NASA conducted a study back in 2015 about habitats for Mars, and various industry and college teams looked at this. This was the winner of, I think, a $25,000 prize, the Mars Ice House. So they constructed slabs of ice and built them into a dome above the Martian surface that would emit light to a subsurface habitat. The water is a very good radiation absorbent, and so you got radiation protection from this exterior skin. And that was a concept that NASA chose as the winner. Here's another concept that came in second, and it was a habitat constructed of local Mars materials again, not water, but in this case, the regolith. And it buried the outpost underneath sufficient mass that you got the radiation protection from cosmic rays and solar flares that you desired. So people have been thinking along these lines over the last few years about how to design from local materials the right habitat to protect the crew. Can we protect them on the way to and from, as well as on the surface of Mars? We've got solar flares to deal with, which provide a lot of electrons and protons blasting your spacecraft en route. You know, my radiation exposure on my short trips in space was minimal. I think if I looked at my records, if I recollect, it was I had a career limit for radiation that I could receive before I'd have to stop flying in space. I got 3% of that during my trips to the space station and aboard the space shuttle. People on the space station, they experience cosmic rays, of course, and solar flares, but they're within the Earth's geomagnetic field. So they're mostly protected just as we are down here on Earth. So if you look at this bar graph, here's sea level cosmic radiation with the dose up here on the horizontal scale. And you see a CT scan for your abdomen. You get 6 months on the space station. This is your average dose at 100 millisieverts. And that's still within your career limit. You can do several trips to the space station. But then Mars Science Lab, the Curiosity rover, on the way to Mars measured this radiation level. that's a one-way trip to Mars. So right now, you'll probably bust your career radiation limit on one single trip to Mars. And that doesn't include the surface exposure that you'll get, but you can mitigate that by going underground. So it is a problem. We have to find ways to shield people effectively on transit. Another problem that we face on transit is free fall. And so far, nobody has proposed artificial gravity as a practical solution. It's heavy and it's expensive. So you've got free fall systems like this treadmill that Sunny Williams is using on the space station. That combined with an exercise bike and with this weightlifting device, it's called the Advanced Resistive Exercise Device, allows you to load your skeleton sufficiently that if you exercise every day in a combination fashion, you can protect your skeleton and muscles almost completely for 6 months in space. And Scott Kelly came back in pretty good shape too after his nearly year in space. So it looks like we can deal with free fall, but radiation is still an unsolved problem. Now, who saw the movie The Martian? Yeah, it was a good movie. I saw it 3 times. I liked it. Good sense of humor. I like the novel even better. Let me tell you why The Martian wasn't realistic. The transit spacecraft was this huge royal yacht traveling between Earth and Mars called the Hermes. And it had a centrifuge that spun to provide the crew with artificial gravity. It's just a palatial spacecraft. That was the gym. And you saw what Sunny Williams was working out in. Let's see if we can go back to that. You know, this is the gym on the International Space Station, right next to the outhouse, right there. And there's a guy working on that resistive exercise device right behind that. So you're going to be living in a can on the way to and from Mars, not on the Hyatt traveling to and from Mars, okay? The other unrealistic thing about that whole spaceship was that NASA would never get enough money to build it. It's just impossibly luxurious and expensive, but it looked great. Another factor that they ignored in The Martian was radiation on the surface. So Matt Damon was living on the surface in a habitat. He drove hundreds of miles across the surface, completely ignoring the radiation issue. They just left that out of the movie because it just didn't make for good storytelling. Who wants to live underground on Mars for years at a time? So, but I like this habitat. You know, it was sort of like a big tent set up there, and he had one of the airlock hatches blow out. It's about 7 feet tall or something like that, and he fixed it with duct tape and plastic sheeting. So if the atmospheric pressure inside that habitat is 14.7 pounds per square inch, you do a back of the envelope calculation, the pressure on this plastic sheeting is 30 tons. Duct tape probably won't hold it. So Matt Damon would have died in that accident too. All right, so let's close up with some realistic talk about physics and financing. If we want to get out to the asteroids, the moon and Mars, you know, how are we going to pay for it? Hundreds of billions of dollars to build a single expedition. I'm exaggerating. Hundreds of billions of dollars to build the systems over 30 years or 20 years to create a transit vehicle like this in Earth orbit and then getting ready to launch it to Mars. And you got to pay for the cargo that you ship there in advance. It's going to have to be an international consortium that comes up with the funds for this. And the only financial return from a trip to Mars is knowledge. There's no way to make a product on Mars that you can sell for value back here. So it's a big financial challenge. We have to find some way to come up with the finances to make human deep space exploration a reality. And that's commerce. Here's Thomas Jefferson writing to the Lewis and Clark expedition leaders back in 1803. And he says, you know, you're going to explore the Missouri River, go all the way to the Pacific Ocean, find the communication routes across the continent, but you're going to do it for the purposes of commerce. And yes, we're going to find out about life on Mars. Yes, we're going to find out about the history of the moon. But the only way that we're going to establish ourselves as a species in space is to make money there. It's going to be financially driven by commerce, making a product that you can sell to the 7 billion of us back here on Earth. And that's very evident in this chart. There's a thin black line at the bottom of this bar of the federal budget a couple of years ago. 3.7 trillion total budget. NASA's was about 18 billion 2 years ago. That thin black line is what NASA gets out of the federal budget every year. 0.5% of the federal budget. So NASA's not going to get a 10 times increase in its budget over the next 20 years to fly people to Mars. We're going to have to find funding from some other source. NASA's empowered to promote the fullest commercial use of space right in its founding legislation. So it should be able to partner with these commercial companies and create a private-public partnership that can develop the systems and the lower costs needed to get yourself here someday. So whether it's mining asteroids or producing rocket fuel on the moon to enable the cost to drop so that we can afford the Mars expeditions that we've seen in Hollywood, It's going to be that public-private partnership that creates this as a reality. Governments alone, I don't think, will ever swallow the cost, even in 2040, to send humans to Mars on a repeat basis. So what are the challenges for people in the future? You've got to design some useful habitats. Here at Purdue, you're starting out on that journey. We're going to have to learn how to operate on the space station, then on the moon or near the moon, and then out at the asteroids before we can go to Mars. About 20 years of homework ahead of us to do that job. And the people who do that job, to design the systems on the ground, design the habitats for the astronauts, design the spacecraft to go there, it's going to be a complete turnover of a generation. I'm retired from NASA. The people on the space station, they'll be too old to participate in anything having to do with Mars 20 years down the line. Even these 2013 selectees by NASA, they'll be at the ends of their careers. So it's pretty obvious that you in the audience here are the ones who will have to step up to this challenge. Heck, even Matt Damon's going to be too old to go to Mars someday. So you've got to step up to it, and the country is counting on that. NASA is going to be hiring astronauts for the foreseeable future for not only the space station, but for deep space expeditions. But the commercial space companies are going to be looking for people, not only to be the ground crew and rocket manufacturers of today, but the crew members who will participate in space hotels and space factories and space labs that will be under private auspices in the space between the Earth and the Moon in the next 10 years or so. And Goldman Sachs just predicted this past month that in 10 years we could have $1 trillion off-planet economy taking place in space through commercial enterprises moving to space for manufacturing, research, and for tourism. So the biggest attraction for America over the last 230 years of its history has been the attraction of expanding the frontier and exploring unknown territory. And for our society today, that's still true. We're looking for opportunities that are off-planet, that can provide us with the technical challenges to make our educational systems, our governmental programs more efficient, more innovative, to keep the United States a technical competitor around the world in the 21st century. Any partner that we have in the space station today is interested in going to space because they can get the benefits of high tech into their workforce and make it a competitive player on the world economy. And so we've got the International Space Station partners. China is pursuing that path as well. And for the United States to compete, we're going to need the best of our academic system and the best of our government programs to make this happen. So I think that I'm an optimist. I think we will see humans on Mars around 2040, but it will probably be after we develop the economic potential of the Earth-Moon system for the next 10 to 20 years, make a stab at producing wealth off-planet. And then the obvious value of that will build the public support, I think, that we need to reach Mars one day. So I wish all of you at Purdue much success in your careers here at the university and moving forward. And I think this deep space challenge that Purdue has set for itself to develop these resilient extraterrestrial habitats is exactly what the college and the nation need today. Thank you very much. Thank you. So if you have any questions, I think we have a few minutes before we have to break. So raise your hand, I'll try to cover a few. And Peter, you can tell me when to stop, okay? All right, great. Anybody have a question? Way in the back, yes, sir.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for your presentation. My question is, why did the government cut the transportation program and rely on other countries? And what is NASA focusing right now regarding funding?
So the second part of your question, what was it again? Funding?
What is NASA focusing now regarding funding? Transportation that is cut as part of the...
Okay. All right, so the history, I alluded to this a little bit. So we had the Columbia accident in 2003. We lost my friends on the Columbia. The ship was lost. And then that forced the country to re-examine its human spaceflight program. So President Bush, after about a year after the accident, he came out and made a nice speech saying, we're going to retire the shuttles when the space station is complete, because those two programs are married together. And as a follow-on to the shuttle, we will develop a transport system to get people not only to Earth orbit and the space station, but also to the moon by 2019, and then Mars as the long-range goal beyond that. So people on the moon by 2019. So we're 2 years away and nowhere close to that goal. So when the Obama administration came in, that program called Constellation was underway. And there was the idea that when the shuttle retired in about 2010, that 2 years later, the Orion spacecraft would begin to provide transport to the space station on a couple of rockets. One, a big cargo rocket without a crew, and then a smaller Ares 1 rocket that would carry crew. And those two rockets together could provide the cargo lift and the human capacity to get to the moon about 10 years later. Well, that was canceled by the Obama administration when they came in 2010. I think Constellation was canceled for what they said, what the administration said were rising costs and a schedule that was not maintainable. So instead, the Obama administration said, we're going to go finish the space station, retire the shuttle when it's complete, and that was in 2011. That happened. And then the astronaut transport would not be done by a government rocket anymore. It would be done by these commercial companies. Commercial cargo had been started by the Bush administration, and then the Obama folks moved that commercial cargo up a level to astronaut transport. And so NASA was told to develop with those companies, SpaceX and Boeing, an astronaut transport system. And the idea would be that it would be cheaper to do it on commercial rockets than any NASA system could be operated for. And I think that's a valid argument. The trouble is, it's taken much longer to implement than originally scheduled. Instead of that new rocket or transport being available in 2012, which was what the original plan was, here it is 2017, and we haven't even flown a crew on one of those vehicles. And so we've been forced to rely on the Russian partners rocket, the Soyuz, for the last 6 years and counting. And it's been a lot of money going over to the Russian space program, the Russian government economy, and also the risk that you take is that the Russians will still be our partners, right? Mr. Putin isn't very fond of us at the moment. But on the space operations level, it's been unperturbed by the geopolitical tensions between the two countries. So I guess to answer the second part of your question, NASA's funding outlook is they've got the money to bring those commercial transports online and then pay for a couple of flights per year. And those providers will then use those same transports for tourism, for building a space hotel, whatever other purposes they want, because NASA's not by itself a sufficient customer. So NASA's outlook is get the ISS transport problem taken care of and put to bed, and then we'll devote our human spaceflight energies on lunar activities and beyond.
If you go to the dark craters on the moon, how are you going to have a power source? What's going to be in the power source?
Question is on the shadowed craters at the lunar poles, how do you create a power source that can keep you alive and warm down there? And they are really frigid. The temperature on the floor of those shadowed craters is, it's below minus 200 Fahrenheit easily. So ideally, you would have nuclear power that you could use round the clock. And early NASA plans for putting an outpost at the poles of the moon back in the mid-2000s were to land a nuclear reactor right on the rim of one of those craters and just take a cable or an umbilical cable or an extension cord down into the bottom of the crater and use it for the work that you have to do there. But you can find craters actually where there's continual sunlight on the rim, and then at the floor, it's continually shadowed. So you could use solar energy there too if you site it in the right place. I'm a fan of nuclear power in space because it's much less bulky in terms of the acres of solar panels that you need. You see that on the space station today. Going to Mars and operating on solar power is a non-starter with me because it's subject to dust contamination. You need much more acreage because of the distance of Mars from the sun. So we should bite the bullet and build space-qualified nuclear reactors. They're simple. They are uninterruptible, as they say, and that would be providing an ample power budget rather than a shoestring power budget for human explorers. And that means safety, and that's what concerns me. So nuclear power is the way to go. Anybody else? Okay, well, I wish to thank you again for welcoming me to Purdue. I hope we can start some conversations offline here, too. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you, Tom, for a engaging presentation. I'm Jay Malash. I'm a planetary scientist here at Purdue and part of the Resilient Extraterrestrial Habitat Engineering Project. And my only role here is to take Tom to the next component of his visit, which is a brown bag lunch over in the Purdue Memorial Union If those of you would like to ask some questions on a personal level, you're welcome to join us at the lunch. It's in the West Faculty Lounge. That is the second floor. It's a brown bag lunch, which means you have to bring your own lunch. But otherwise, we'll be there for about an hour and a half for further discussion. Let's thank Tom again.